You know, as they say, if you're here, you're going to learn about blockchain, so you can leave. We'll give you a minute to leave elegantly, and we won't say anything except take names. Well, welcome. We'll give people another 30 seconds or so to mill in. Okay, Fred's got to leave.
Elegant.
Elegant. There's always one. Well, aside from making you intolerable at a cocktail party because you'll be able to talk about blockchain, we hope to provide some clarity over something that I think is somewhat misunderstood, if not misunderstood, at least narrowly understood. And by narrowly understood, I mean that it has to do, blockchain that's the cryptocurrency stuff that, we deal with, Bitcoin. And one of the things that we want to make it clear here is that the blockchain is something that is much broader. And I remember about 2 years ago when I first heard about, or 2 or 3 years ago, maybe 2.5 years ago, it was here at Stanford that people started talking about blockchain, really just in the context of Bitcoin. And it was one of those moments of aha moments that you go, wait a minute, what if we started using this same type of mechanism to do other things? And I'm in my almost 9th year here at Stanford Law School as a fellow, and I started writing about the use of blockchain to basically make data that is collected by drones and other autonomous vehicles immutable. How do you make the data that is to make it actionable, how do you make it immutable? And the idea there was that we could use blockchain. And lo and behold, 2 years later, now here we are sitting in a panel on blockchain, where before it was just something that was mentioned haphazardly within the context of other things. So again, our goal here at this panel is not to define what a blockchain is. We presume that you have a basic knowledge, and one of you at least has confessed to me before we began that you do not have quite an understanding of what blockchain is. So what we're going to hopefully do for you as you walk out of this room, you will have at least some understanding of what a blockchain is by the very fact that you have heard about some of the applications that it's used for. And then you can connect the dots. And if you want to know what a blockchain really is, all you need to do is Google it, and you can pretty much figure this out within about 10 minutes. There's a ton of YouTube videos about it as well. Some are good, some are not so good, but you can figure that part out. The important thing for you here as lawyers is to be able to talk the talk that if you're in-house counsel or you have clients that come to you with blockchain question use cases, you're able to at least not look entirely stupid. And say, okay, well, what about this? What about that? So part of this is issue spotting, and not that you need to understand everything there is to know about blockchain, but at least have an ability to connect the dots. And that's really the key here to this stuff, is to say, okay, well, this is like this, and hopefully you'll have these aha moments as we talk here. I'm not going to introduce the panel. You've got the bios here in front of you, and I think if you've chosen to be here, you've probably figured out who's what. And so we're going to be starting talking about blockchain from the perspective of an infrastructure. And when you do that, once you start talking about a blockchain as an infrastructure, it has this calibration effect. It says, okay, this is where it fits in the grand ecosystem. This is where this technology fits. And when you start thinking about blockchain as infrastructure, not as just this really nerdy word, it's actually something that has to do with infrastructure, then you start saying, okay, I can start seeing that there's applications that can be built on top of this infrastructure. And we're going to be talking to you, Victoria, at least about this particular question. If we draw similarities to the DNS and to TCP/IP with blockchain, where does that take us? What does that substantiate?
Well, let me take a step back, and that's just, again, for level setting expectations, although presumably people who are here do know what blockchain is. But at its core, blockchain is a form of database technology. It's a shared database. It's a shared ledger that's not controlled necessarily by one single party, but by multiple parties that can input data and the integrity and validity of that data is arrived at by complicated algorithms and the systems of consensus. So if we think of a database, right, as a form of infrastructure of IT, in a way, that's what blockchain is. But in order for blockchain to work, there has to be an agreement between the parties as to what blockchain platform are you going to be using. And there's multiple, particularly open source. There's Ethereum, there's Hyperledger, there's Corda. So if I want to share data with David's company and I'm on Hyperledger and he's on Corda, either we need to have some level of standard settings or data interfaces to be able to write to the same database and share that information.
Okay, so if we think about the development of TCP/IP and DNS,
Right.
and we talked about in our prep calls, we talked about the Blu-ray versus DVD settings. What can we learn from how these things developed as we look at blockchain?
Well, I mean, in the same way that packets of information, right, with TCP/IP and the advent of the internet, it was really important to have a standard, right, that people agreed, okay, this was a standard that was going to be used for IP naming nomenclature, or the standards that was going to be used for packets of information flowing through, high-speed, lines at the time before, we had Wi-Fi. So without those standards, we could not have that exchange of information, right? And that was the whole point. I mean, the internet was a communication system. In a way, blockchain is a way of sharing data or information with a broad group of people, knowing that the integrity of that data is going to be, if not immutable, at least pretty true.
Who's pushing for the infrastructure development today? Who are the players?
There are a lot of players out there, and that's part of the issue, right? Is I don't think, so far as I can tell, there's not a lot of standard-setting bodies out there, right? I mean, you've got a lot of open source projects like Ethereum and Hyperledger. IBM is a major player. Microsoft is a major player in this ecosystem. But in terms of somebody agreeing, saying, okay, these are the standards we're going to use, I haven't seen that yet.
Is there a danger, and this is for any of you here, is there a danger if we're having so many players, they're pulling in one direction or another? Aren't we in a in a danger of seeing some sort of a fragmentization of this ecosystem, where it's really, at the end of the day, people are using different protocols, and then we lose out as consumers or users that want to use a blockchain. We're losing out because there's just too many. It's almost when you read about the Android versus iOS, there's so many different Android operating systems out there versus the iOS, which is seen as just one, that people who use iOS are better off, some people will say, because it's more stable, because there's only one, versus the Android where there's too many. Is there a fragmentization problem because we have so many different players?
There potentially could be, right? But then again, if you think about the early days of computer networking, right, where, it's not like you only had Cisco, you had several, computer networking companies out there, developing Ethernet switches or routers, right? But they all agreed that they were going to use certain open standards. So you can have many players as long as standards are agreed upon.
Right. Ryan, do you want to add anything about that?
Yeah. Can everybody hear me? Yep. Yeah? All right, great. I actually think, the level of fragmentation is intentional in some ways, and it's sort of the idea we're at the stage where it's protocol as standard setting organization, right? And the adoption of the protocol, in some cases as determined by the token price, is an indication of, is considered by many in the space to be an indication of the acceptance of standards. And because of the fragmentation, I do think, if you were to set some standards, if some body independent body were to set some standards, I think they would have to be pretty technology specific at this point, and I don't think that's a scalable approach. So I think while we're not too early to talk about standards, and the environment is such that doing so would be really choosing winners and losers in a much larger conversation.
So if we're thinking about as standards, what do you think, if we looked at an organization like NIST or ISO, what would you want to see coming out of an organization like that? What would we want to see them say about a blockchain that would make us as lawyers feel good?
I'd love to take that because terminology would be, so we could have a shared terminology because the truth of what, no, I was going to make a joke that we didn't define blockchain because we couldn't agree on a definition. It's probably true. It's probably true. But we didn't actually have the conversation. And I think, we don't have a common language to discuss these things. There have been suggestions about taxonomies that we could use to discuss various blockchains, and I think they all sort of fail and have failed in sort of achieving adoption. And so I think a shared language is always the best place to start, when we're talking about standards.
Okay. David, any thoughts?
Yeah, I think we're in a wild and woolly, very early stage where no one knows. And different blockchains or distributed ledgers are used or optimized for different purposes. And so it would be like comparing a Formula One race car with a Prius. They're both cars, and you could maybe agree they all have four wheels, but they're not used for the same thing. And I think as you look across the various, and this may be a good segue into the next topic. You've got the public blockchains, you've got different variants. So if you look at Bitcoin, the original blockchain, and then Ethereum, which is the second largest. Ethereum has this great functionality that you can launch new tokens, on the Ethereum blockchain. So that's special functionality that's unique to that blockchain that is not present on Bitcoin. So we're talking about radically different features and functions. So I think we're at a stage where so much of this is being invented, blue sky. It's going to take a couple of years to kind of shake out what makes sense, to industries and users.
And to that point, there's actually Ethereum Classic too, so there's actually two forks of the Ethereum, two networks within Ethereum that have that a common functionality. And I think that forking that is occurring not just, has been really a feature of the Bitcoin world and now the blockchain world throughout since Namecoin was the early altcoin in Bitcoin, a fork of Bitcoin. That functionality, which is sort of will get us somewhere, towards a world where we can talk about shared standards, but it's not happening yet.
Clearly not happening yet, but I think it's something that at some point, has to happen.
So as lawyers, if we have clients coming and talking to us about a private or a public blockchain, what are from an issue spotting perspective, what do we need to be aware of if a client starts talking to us about these different settings or different types of blockchain? Where do we need to steer them? What do we need to think about?
There's pros and cons to both, right? The idea of a public blockchain is that the data lives in more nodes, so therefore the cryptographic algorithm is a little bit more complex, so there has to be consensus across more nodes. Basically, more matching would be one way to look at it for the data. So people argue that in public blockchains, there's more data integrity. However, your data potentially is exposed to more parties. It could be confidentiality issues, et cetera, which is why financial services companies are not too happy with a public blockchain. On the other hand, if you're going to use blockchain to deploy, say, like a complex securities trading application, right? You're probably just going to want to have the securities and various banking banks share that data. So it's closed, but the data integrity, or if say some players drop out, there's there's one party potentially, or two parties, or three parties, as opposed to many parties controlling the integrity of the data.
We promised to talk about specific applications. So what if we had an application, a client came and said, we want to use it in supply chain management. We have a blockchain implementation. What would you suggest? What kind of a blockchain would you recommend?
I would need more data. I would need more data as to who are all the parties in the supply chain. Like how many suppliers are there? Who is the client intending to share the data with? Is it like their potential customers, that want to basically check, the goods in the flow of commerce to see if, there's no goods from embargoed countries, et cetera. And probably I would argue that a private blockchain with just the parties at hand, especially if there are multiple parties, that would be sufficient as opposed to a Bitcoin-like purely public blockchain.
Yeah, I mean, blockchains are optimized for different things. So you have privacy, scalability, speed, security. You call it innovation ecosystem. So you could argue that the Bitcoin blockchain is the biggest innovation ecosystem. So you have the most support from independent developers. And then governance. I mean, as Victoria mentioned, this is a shared database. So who's making decisions, potentially to change it down the road? For the Bitcoin purists out there, they probably argue that that's the most secure, proven blockchain. I mean, it's able to verify anonymous transactions between parties. It's proven itself over 9 years. There's a good track record there. But it takes 10 minutes to verify a transaction. And so if you're in a commercial environment where you have a lot of transactions happening, Bitcoin just doesn't work from a scalability standpoint. Furthermore, Bitcoin is starting to get very expensive. As demand increases and the transaction volume increases, it's supply and demand. And so in that 10 minutes, it's who ultimately will pay the most to have their transaction confirmed. So for all those reasons, a public blockchain doesn't work for Wall Street, where you have huge numbers of transactions. You don't have any need to settle anonymous parties and counterparties. You know the other party. You certainly have know your customer, and anti-money laundering laws, to uphold. And so an anonymous settlement system like Bitcoin just doesn't fit. So really, back to your supply chain and echoing what Victoria said, it really depends on whether or not it's an occasional thing, or if you're trying to manage an entire ecosystem of worldwide vendors, insurers, trade finance. If you have multiple complex parties in the system, then you probably need a private blockchain.
Let's start, Victoria. Okay. So.
I just wanted to raise one thing, which is this is an example of the shared language, sort of the need to define common terminology, because the private versus public distinction can take a couple of can sort of be discussed at different levels of abstraction. And for example, public versus private may refer to the network participants as a whole who can participate in the system, and permissioned versus permissioned less refer to who can validate, who can write to the database. And so, it's an example. We're both, nothing's right and nothing's wrong because we don't have a shared standards at all. But there's multiple levels of public versus private conversations that you can have.
Within a private blockchain setting, Victoria, when we were talking, you had mentioned a very interesting use for a blockchain, which would be to follow goods as they move from one point from shipping point to destination point, as using the blockchain as almost a ledger to see the life cycle of those goods as they traveled from point A to point B. Can you elaborate on that, please?
Well, I mean, if you think about it, right, the international commerce is dependent on letters of credit, right? And it's a slow process, right? You're a seller of goods, and you negotiate with the buyer, and the buyer, there's all these like complex Incoterms, free on board, this, that, and the other, and once the buyer receives the goods, right? The seller knows that there's an open letter of credit, and that the seller's going to get paid and not get shipped along the way. A lot of this, if you think about it, a shared ledger where there's integrity to the data, and where you can use sensors, for example, to see where your container is at any point, or whether or not, say, if you're shipping wine as an example, that the temperature was kept correctly so that the goods definitely were not damaged, would be a pretty powerful use. I mean, I know of some companies, for example, pharmaceuticals that are looking into blockchain to kind of authenticate their pharmaceuticals to avoid any concept that they're counterfeit drugs in any way, and kind of using tokenization as a means of tracking, what products they're putting out to market and the fact that they're authentic as opposed to counterfeit.
Right. And this gets us to talking a little bit about smart contracts, right? Because that's one of the things that you read quite a bit about with blockchain is the idea of smart contracts, application that sit on top of a blockchain. And can you anybody, you want to take that, David? You want to roll with a smart contract? Or?
Yeah, so smart contracts are not really legal contracts. I mean, smart contracts refer to
nor contracts.
Yeah.
I mean, they're really if then else statements that are executed on blockchain, and probably a typical use would be a smart contract that basically says, okay, I've got these funds committed to buy this security, and when you deliver that security to me, the funds will be released. That's governed by this code, which makes it automatic. And so what's unique on blockchain is that you can have asset transfer and currency transfer really as a intrinsic to the messaging. Almost it's almost as if you could embed currency in an email and add logic to that. And so this is really a topic that's in its infancy. The potential applications are nearly endless. So certainly in supply chain, like Victoria mentioned, something as mundane as, I was thinking about this, as I was flying in this morning. If you put an identifiable hash or code on a candy bar, that is manufactured by, say, M&M Mars, and so now that the existence of that candy bar is now entered onto the blockchain, whichever blockchain, and now the blockchain can record each entity that takes possession of that candy bar as it goes through the supply chain. So it goes to the distributor. There's a record on the the shipping manifest for that pallet, and eventually it ends up in some convenience store. And if the whole thing were on blockchain, I mean, embedded in that hash, that candy bar, could be a smart contract that says that when an end customer finally pays for it, automatically all the payments are reconciled to all the parties in that value chain. And so 2 cents goes to the convenience store, and 3 cents goes to the shipper, and 5 cents goes to the warehouse, and so on and so forth. And smart contracts, as they're applied to every unique or uniquely identifiable store of value. As you think about Internet of Things, which was a prior session, I mean, Internet of Things combined with blockchain, combined with smart contracts, is world-changing, potentially.
Agreed.
Right. One of the things that we're, yes, question.
Sorry, I mean,
Yeah.
I just need more clarity on this topic a little bit. So, how is this different from me writing a program that says if X, else Y, and if none of those things, don't do anything? How is that different from this situation? How does blockchain?
It really isn't, right? It's if then this why. The difference is that the data that is triggering what happens with the X and the Y, that data is shared potentially between multiple parties, and the parties cannot argue as to whether or not the data that triggers those actions in the program is correct or not.
So I think it's easier to think, just before we go to sort of from blockchain to physical world, most of the easier to conceptualize examples are blockchain to digital asset. So if you had you could imagine actually there's a use case that exists in music where each I'm trying to remember who, the Imogen Heap, I believe, released a song through a company that I'm not going to remember their name of, and each track that the song was comprised of was separately identified and committed to the blockchain. Now, each track can be separately licensed and included in another composition, and as long as the resulting song is paid for with Ethereum, the funds are for all the contributors, each of the track contributors to the song are dispersed automatically upon payment. That's an easier to me. I know it's a more complicated
to relate
example.
to relate this back to the Bitcoin blockchain. What Bitcoin proved was that you could move value around with trust without a central intermediary or data. So it's not, you don't have Google, you don't have Dropbox, you don't have eBay, right? I mean, Bitcoin is this open source protocol that runs on 7,000 nodes around the world. And so taking that amazing insight, and applying it to supply chain. So rather than relying on some software company that's going to organize what you're describing, now we're basically saying this is a distributed database that's all synchronized. Everyone has access to it, potentially to see what's happening, so that when that candy bar is sold, everyone can potentially see that, and trust then how all the funds are allocated without a bank in the middle or without any other intermediary. I mean, it's a potentially a higher trust system, removing the middlemen.
There was a question up there.
Well, I know software isn't distributed the way it used to be, most often now in boxes. It does still occur in that way. For multiple seat licenses, would you view each seat to need to have a tracking number, if you will, or to be registered in order to avoid license splitting, or would that still be an issue?
Are you asking whether we would use a blockchain to validate users in an enterprise-type software?
Right. I'm just going with the whole end-to-end solution that
I mean,
smart contracts.
there is talk about using blockchain technologies for software license compliance purposes, right? So the idea is that, again, there's like a unique code in the software license, right, that you've just purchased, and it could be, by seat, it could be, site licenses, et cetera. And just like with track of music that gets distributed, that piece of code travels with the underlying software code, and therefore you can tell whether or not the scope of the license is being exceeded. And you can potentially send like an auto message to the person who purchased your software saying you've exceeded the scope, you need to buy X extra licenses or expand it, or else, we're going to terminate your license. I mean, all of that could be automated potentially.
So one of the questions as lawyers, if we get that kind of request from our business client, it would be, why do you need a blockchain for that? What's the purpose of wanting to have an immutable environment, basically? Explain to me. I mean, I spent 11 years as an in-house lawyer, and you get sometimes unpopular by saying, why do you need this? But you need to understand what the use basis is. So, if you're counsel, the question would be, well, why are we using this type of an environment to validate users in a software licensing setting? Is there a different way? Do you think a blockchain actually raises the transactional costs for a business, or is it just a pass? It doesn't really matter.
I mean, I think you touched on the most important threshold question that I always discuss with my clients, which is, why are you doing this? Why do you think you want to use a blockchain? And the answer usually, or to put it another way, why doesn't a centralized database work for you?
Right.
And the answer should be, you're going to you're going to want to stick with the centralized database where you want accountability of the keeper of records, right? Where you want recourse to the keeper of records, you have to think long and hard about using a blockchain. And if you do use one, you'll be using a private blockchain or a permissioned blockchain. And and you're going to want to have vet the parties that can commit to the database. And so, and then the question is, okay, we built this blockchain in our mind, or on paper, whatever. And, what are the cost savings, what are the costs and benefits of going this route versus the traditional centralized database route?
Generally, what I talk to my clients about in that respect is blockchains are great when either audits are expensive, right, and they're like a long process, manual process, which in the case of, for example, doing a bunch of software audits for your clients can be pretty expensive, or because the auditing part is almost self-built into the blockchain, right? Or when there's no trust, and you have to use a third-party intermediary like a securities clearinghouse, and they're expensive. But if you have trust and you don't really need expensive audits, then you don't need a blockchain.
Right. Yeah, trust and accountability, right? They run together. And I think that's, if you go back to Bitcoin, and the idea was to create a medium of exchange that could occur digitally in the same way that cash payments occur, right? And Victoria and I are sitting right next to each other. I could hand her $1, right? But for me to hand her $1 without any cash, and I assure you I don't have any cash, as usual, I would have to involve a third party, and that's not very, it's not elegant, right? And it's seemingly unnecessary. And so by using a blockchain, we can rid ourselves of the need.
David,
So give you another use case that's germane to everyone in this room. So I'm the founder of Integra Ledger, which is going to be a permissioned blockchain for the global legal industry. And so just to explain that use case, for blockchain, which I think most of you will understand, what we're looking to do there is create data integrity. So if you have let's say you have a contract and you have 10 signatories, to that contract, potentially. So you're doing an investment or a joint venture, something like that. You can sign that, and there are services to digitally sign that, and there are services to share the storage of that, whether it's Google Drive or Dropbox or Box.com. What we've proposed is that in this permission blockchain, that contract and all of the signatures are hashed and inserted into this permissioned shared ledger. And so everyone can have their copies, but ultimately they can match up or check to make sure that whatever they've got in their files matches that single source of truth. And so it's for contracts, communications, payments, potentially escrow, things where you want a single source of truth. Broadly, you guys are going to trust each other generally as counterparties. You're going to know each other. We don't need the anonymity of say, the Bitcoin blockchain. But ultimately, we want a single shared ledger that's a source of truth for the way we interact with each other in the global legal community. So in this case, it's going for documents. So it's not assets or candy bars or airplanes. It's contracts and communications. We want agreement that's been memorialized across this public distributed ledger.
So far, yeah.
Kind of wonder, when you said blockchain is basically a shared database, if you're looking at your use case, is that actually the case? Or do you have one central authority who's actually determining what the truth is in that?
It's developing consensus across the various nodes. So if every major law firm ran a node of the system, and every major corporation with an in-house legal department ran a node, if the hash of that contract, and its signatures is written in, onto the blockchain and then replicated across the nodes, right? That prevents anyone from going in and accidentally deleting or tampering or changing it. And so we're using the same mechanism basically as Bitcoin or Ethereum, across hundreds, maybe eventually thousands of nodes, to establish that hash of that contract exists, it's immutable, tamper resistant, accident resistant, so it's highly redundant, highly secure, it's fully encrypted, so it's not like everyone can read it. But what we're doing is we're establishing the existence of that document or that communication or that contract. Does that answer your question?
And it's possible to change it, then there's the database gets changed and there's consensus.
No.
Yeah, append only. It's the append only rather than
Yeah, I mean, you could add an amendment, right? And the parties would have to have a consensus as to what that amendment is to the agreement. But that underlining agreement, once the parties to that agreement say, this is the final version, it's going to live on all these various nodes, and through
Yeah, and
consensus, it's going to be established.
We're focused initially on big law firms, big Fortune 100 type companies, which have humongous numbers of contracts and huge numbers of vendors and suppliers globally. So this massive data integrity issue where, again, using blockchain, you could potentially put thousands or tens of thousands of vendors or suppliers, give them access to this, and when you jointly execute contracts, it's all written there. People keep their own copies, but we're memorializing what was signed and what was. So if there's a dispute that arises, because a hard drive crashed or someone changed something, ultimately you've got this record that's been written across the system, and so we're creating a single source of truth.
I'd actually like to add to that, because I was looking at due diligence over the weekend, and this is an IT due diligence, and I was thinking, something like that would be helpful when we're looking at initial copyright registration granted, XYZ rights, and then those XYZ rights were then given to these 5 people, and then those 5 people then added a bit of that and then sent it to somebody else, and now you're trying to figure out which part is open source, which one's not, and I guess having a more simplified contract, in fact, would be much easier. Just have a broken down, access rights, use rights, whatever rights, and then you just have a ledger and you just look at it within minutes. You know exactly what's happening.
You're advocating for essentially a life cycle record of a particular IP asset that you could say, this is what happened to this IP asset from,
And blockchain is perfect for that
Yeah,
type
and
of.
there's actually a lot of talk about that.
There's a
Same
patent
thing
being
for-
filed right now as we speak. No, I'm kidding.
But also like land use recordation, like recording, easements, and there's a lot of talk about using blockchain for that as well.
See, that's one of the interesting ones where I have frequent discussions. It's like, because, you got to really be careful about the consensus mechanisms for, Bitcoin's easy because because the miners, the validators are incented to, they effectively get paid in Bitcoin. So they don't want to mess with the integrity of the network, right? And so the people who hold Bitcoin and the people who validate the transactions are aligned. That's really difficult to create when you're dealing with things other than tokens, and it's really difficult to have that alignment and to systemize it in the same way that Bitcoin, in the same way that the incentive align the incentives in a way that it provides the protection that you'd want for your house, right? Because ultimately, I own my house, despite what the county says, right? The fact that the county says that I own my house, that's good, but there's other evidence that it does not exist on the blockchain or in the county the register that says I own the house, and so sort of this is where the smart contract stuff and code as law really gets challenged, because again, I don't want a self-effectuating event to occur with respect to my house, right? Unless you are darn sure that I am me, right? Which is always difficult to do on networks, and that I actually did intend to transfer my house.
We had a question.
Yeah, I wanted to follow up on the last question, where if the blockchain is guaranteeing authentication of particular rights that have been set up in the creation of this blockchain, so in this case, with access rights and update rights, if you want to then add additional functionality, so for instance, reseller rights, do you need to go back and create a brand new private blockchain, or are there mechanisms to extend lookup functionality, metadata functionality, other things ancillary to the authentication?
It would be a functionality consensus, right? What the network agrees the rules for adding functionality is and what the threshold for that agreement would be. So if in the law firm, I'm not sure how Integra is designed, but presumably there's some sort of mechanism for determining effectively voting rights, consensus voting rights, and some sort of threshold that needs to be exceeded to say effectively what's on the Integra ledger is what's on the Integra ledger, right? And for that to change, there has to be agreement that, okay, this has now occurred, 51%, whatever it is, of the, I don't know, the lawyers? I don't know how you
Yeah,
guys weight the...
Just like the Ethereum blockchain is governed by the Ethereum Foundation, Integra is going to be governed by the Integra Foundation, the trustees of which will be major law firms, law schools, that sort of thing. So there's that component from a governance standpoint. As you know, there's also the question of just who runs the nodes, and what additional voting they potentially have, in this environment. This gets back to the original question about public versus permission versus private. So in the case of the legal industry, this is a fairly homogeneous industry, and particularly if we're starting with, say, the AmLaw 100, and Fortune 100, Fortune 500. I mean, these are groups that are very similar, culturally, educationally, same sort of work, same sort of issues. I mean, if you're a patent lawyer, you have the patent problem. If you're a real estate lawyer, you have real estate problems. And so, intrinsic to this effort is the fact that there's broad agreement on the utility application, for why we're bringing this into existence, and it's for very specific uses around data integrity. Now it may be expanded over time. Again, this gets back to this question of which blockchain, why, how do you set it up? Is it industry specific? Is it public?
Would you say that we're actually not changing the blockchain itself if we have such additional requirements, but we're changing the applications that are sitting on top of the blockchain? Would you say that's inaccurate?
That was the first reaction I had to his question, was that's going to be part of the smart contract. And I hate the word smart contract because they're neither smart nor contracts. They're basically an application that lives on top of the blockchain. And, just like any software, you potentially can update it to add more functionality as long as the parties who are part of that, I'm assuming it's going to be a permissioned blockchain, agree that, features and functionality can be added to it later.
Right. So we're thinking of, again, going back to our initial comments, the blockchain is really the infrastructure. So you're not changing the infrastructure to add functionality. You're adding functionality through the applications that are sitting on this infrastructure. That's how you're getting some of this new output that you're demanding from this infrastructure. I saw a hand up there. Someone? No? Change your mind? Okay. I do want to shift us to talking a little bit about IoT. We all sitting here, we probably all know that IoT is an exploding type of application with billions of nodes, we can call it from a blockchain terminology, with constantly feeding data to centralized repositories about different types of events, depending on what these IoT devices are. If it's a refrigerator, if it's a wearable device, if it's a car, an autonomous car, there can be numerous types of data that it's feeding. Let's talk a little bit about the blockchain application there. We're getting at least one value there is that these nodes are all authenticated nodes.
I'd rather call them devices than
Devices,
than
okay.
nodes. I think nodes are a little bit of a misnomer in that
Okay.
respect. What's happening is you have these devices, sensors really, that are collecting data, and they're often processing that data in the device itself. They have fairly advanced microprocessors, which is known as edge computing, right? And then transmitting that data generally to a central repository. So if you have your Nest thermostat, right, the Nest thermostat is collecting data about the temperature in your home. They've got their information gateway to which, they send that data to, and then, Nest probably has these complicated algorithms that they're trying to, or maybe appending extra data from other sources, et cetera. and now creating a picture of what's useful or how to improve their products or how to sell that data set to other parties. The issue with Internet of Things is that, okay, you're collecting all this data, but as this data is moving around, right, and being shared, the integrity of that data can be compromised. There can be data corruption at any point in that process. What, in theory, blockchain could help is through consensus, particularly as, with quantum computing, as processing gets quicker, potentially down the line in the future, you could protect the integrity of the data.
Yeah, and you can have machine-to-machine transactions, right? That are which sound bizarre, and from a legal perspective, we're going to need to change the way we think of a lot of things, right? Because now you're not associating a who, a legal identity with a what, right? But you're associating a what with a what, right? And ultimately, and there are some use cases that are live. There's some amazing examples that I think there was actually a computer that was sold to developers just to develop machine-to-machine applications on the blockchain. So there's amazing.
Well, it begs the question: is Internet of Things going to follow the same pattern of centralized data stores, right? Or will it truly be decentralized?
Well, again, though, we don't have centralized data stores just because
I'm not
it's
suggesting
easy
it's bad.
architecturally.
Yeah.
It's there's value derived by the administrator of the central
No.
architecturally.
Yeah.
It'll be interesting to see which choice is.
Well, it's, as someone said in another conference I was at, if centralization adds value, fantastic. If centralization actually adds friction, reduces data integrity and increases cost due to the intermediary, then it's bad.
Right.
So if we're thinking about concepts like, we have Internet of Things, there's also this concept called Internet of People, where you have embedded device on human beings, wetware type applications. What do you see as the blockchain applications there in terms of ensuring the immutability of data that is being transmitted by these devices? Let's say a doctor is collecting information from, and I'm not talking about a pacemaker because that's not a new application, but let's talk about more sophisticated applications, nanotype devices embedded in a human being where they are transmitting data constantly. What are the benefits that you think we see in a blockchain, and are we talking a public or a private setting?
It's a tough question. First of all, the issue with the data integrity starts with the sensor, right? So the sensor is collecting faulty data. Now you just have immutable wrong data.
Right.
Garbage.
And the authentication, which is the other part of that, right? Like if you think I'm me, and I'm really Victoria. The sensor is collecting data about Victoria.
But can the blockchain, are you suggesting the blockchain is also a way to validate wrong data?
No, that's kind of what I'm arguing, is that once you know the data is correct, the blockchain helps in kind of preventing that data from being corrupted or mutated later on. But it's not going to prevent it from being wrong the moment it enters a shared database.
Bad data is bad data.
Right.
Bad data
Yeah.
is bad.
And bad
garbage in,
authentication is bad authentication. Right.
There you go. Right. Garbage in, garbage out.
Exactly.
It stays the same.
And the danger, I think, of this whole smart contract concept is this idea that we can rely upon data that's based on the same authentication standards that we use, in some cases, worse authentication standards than we use today in e-commerce, right? You have to, it's essentially a PKI-based authentication framework that could be implemented using the blockchain. That is, if you associated your real-world identity with your public key, your address, you'd have the ability to create a great PKI framework for authentication, but you need to build that identity layer first.
And then, the old saying that sometimes, features are bugs, right? The mutability can be great, but it can also be a bug, right? So, because again, somebody's entering this data or a sensor is collecting this data, and like I said, if the data is faulty the moment it enters the database, then it's a complicated process through consensus to like reverse or change that data.
But let's assume, just for the sake of this panel, that the data that we're dealing with is correct. All right? There's no problem with the sensor. So I don't want to get into a product liability perspective from a faulty sensor perspective. Let's talk about the immutability of the data insofar as the end user of the data, be it Nest or be it a doctor or be it some other application, the failure to use a blockchain. Do you see the possibility of us, or not possibility, maybe a more accurate term would be the probability of us and advisability of us moving into a setting where the failure to use a blockchain in these settings would actually be the negligence aspect because you did not take a reasonable procedure?
Again, it depends where that data is moving to, how many parties it's going to, how many databases or parties or networks it's going to choose. If it's, if it's just going from the patient straight to the, say, the hospital where that doctor works and there's no intermediaries, I mean, do you really need a blockchain?
Let me give you a different application. You have an autonomous vehicle that's collecting data on the road, all right? It's constantly picking up a number of variables and multiply that by millions, more vehicles. There's multiple parties that are collecting data, multiple parties that are using the data because other vehicles think of ways of how other users use the data that's being disseminated by other users. Think about it from the perspective of vehicles collecting this information, storing it in a central repository, broadcasting it out to other users. Do you see a blockchain application there?
I think that if people are really going to want to rely on the data and the integrity of the data, they probably should use a blockchain at that point. Is it 100%, bulletproof? No, nothing is. But
I'd want somebody to sue, I think, in that case. I mean, I don't,
You would not be a very sympathetic plaintiff, or maybe you would. If you.
No, I'd want somebody to sue who was responsible for the integrity of the data. I would want a single party with accountability that I could go after if the data was wrong.
Right. I mean, at what point, that's going to be the issue, is traceability. At what point? Now, so to me, a better example than yours, because there's too many players, would be, let's take your hospital and doctor patient example. Now, let's say you're the insurance company, and, you're the hospital who's going to share data with the insurance provider, right? The insurance company is going to want some level of comfort knowing that the data that was collected hasn't been tampered with in one way or another by the hospital, et cetera, before they pay a claim. And so now you've got, some level of accountability as to, okay, you're talking about 2, 3, 4 parties and maybe a permission blockchain, and the fact that, okay, once the data enters the shared ledger, okay, it's closed, nobody's going to be able to, tamper with it. I think in that situation, it's a little more likely.
Yeah, I mean, the best way to find use cases in some ways is you look for intermediaries, right? And then you think about whether distributed version of the intermediary would make sense, and if so, what would do we want to have minimum thresholds, sort of vetting that needs to apply to the people who are keeping changing the database. And so if it's no, if the answer to that question is no, everybody should be able to, then public and permissionless,
Yep.
right? And if the answer is yes, we want everybody to be able to use it, but we only want certain people to be able to change it, then you'd be public but permissioned or something like that. And anyways, yeah.
We have a question up there.
I'm sorry, you were just talking about, the data not being able to tamper with, and I understand the reason for the need for integrity. But what do you do in an accuracy situation with regard to if there's a mistake?
That's what I was alluding at. It's complicated. Then you have to kind of have the parties, the governance parties, agree to reverse it. That's what caused the fork in the Ethereum code base, because you had the diehard Ethereum people that said, no, the code is a contract. So when somebody tampered, with the data and basically created a transaction for how many millions of dollars that was paid incorrectly, the governance bodies said, no, we're going to reverse the transaction, and they agreed and they reversed it. But then the purists said, well, no, the code is a contract and we should have never done that. And that's why we have 2 code bases for Ethereum. So you either have to agree up front as to, during, the people who are governing this permission-based blockchain, like what's going to happen if there's an error, how are you going to correct it, what are the protocols for correction. My company Accenture has done something that's become very, very controversial, admitting to the fact that for things, especially related to like data identity or something like that, where data entry errors could happen and how do you correct it, we've created and patented this technology, which is we're calling it a mutable blockchain with a scar. So the parties that are in the permissioned blockchain, so it only works for like a group of people, not a completely open blockchain. You know, the party says, okay, I've created a data error, you correct it, but it leaves a record of the fact that that data's been changed.
Yeah, so
So it keeps the auditability or the traceability.
And the reason I'm thinking about that is if you're thinking about health data and other things, I'm thinking about people who have rights of access who are not in the collection chain, but it's about them, so they have rights of access and correction. And there are a lot of systems and like you have to be able to do it.
And that's why we came up with this technology, was thinking specifically for things like health data, you know, how to correct your PII if people wanted to chase. For example, think about using blockchain to kind of trace where your personal information has been sent to, right? But, you know, all of a sudden you realize that your PII is wrong in whatever e-commerce site that collected it.
Yeah, go ahead. Dan.
You know, if we're not spending so much time and money, you know, worrying about managing sort of imperfection, you know, in that the chain of control of data, you know, I think there's potential for a lot more emphasis and investment to go into, you know, getting it right when it is put on the blockchain in the first place. I mean, to take your patent example, I mean, if we know that once that patent file is on blockchain, you know, that there's going to be tremendous data integrity and confidence there, that means we need to spend more time. We can redirect resources away from managing, again, that sort of the chaos that you described, move those resources to making sure that, you know, or focusing on how that information gets on the blockchain in the first place, you know, whether it's health records or, you know, IP and patents. I mean, I think that's one potential shift in focus.
Yeah, anybody else have a question that has not asked a question, just waiting? We haven't heard from? Yes.
Going back to the Ethereum fork, was that an authentication problem then, or was that actually tampering with the blockchain?
Wait, when they corrected it? So they basically, you know, it's supposed to be an append-only database, right? And they actually, rather than, because they didn't know who perpetrated the attack, they couldn't effectively reverse it by having the money, the ether sent back. They had to excise that transaction from the history of the Ethereum network. And to do that, they had to fork the network. And those that didn't agree went on and kept the Ethereum Classic network. And those that did agree to the new forked network with the revised history.
But some would argue it wasn't even an attack.
No.
I mean, they just took the
It was
code
an attack.
and
It
they
wasn't
exploited it.
Yeah, they exploited
They exploited an imperfection in the code. And so,
So there was an imperfection in the code that enabled this transaction, that transfer, or the transfer was not.
and so
It was bad.
Yeah, so
It was bad.
So the
It
Ethereum
was-
Classic guys, the guys that you know didn't agree, you know, with rolling that back, basically said, I mean, the smart contract was written, you know, it was used, you know, to the fullest extent. Maybe it was not the way it was intended, and that's life. That's the code is law argument.
Just from a perspective of time, I do want to wrap up, and we'll stick around for a number of questions if you have after we're done here. But I think one of the takeaways, again, we're in a best practices type conference, and one of the things that you want to think about in terms of issue spotting is that if you have an application that requires immutability, you want to start thinking about a blockchain if you have not been asked by your business people about that. It's a question you can ask. You know, have we thought about blockchain?
Back to trust and auditability. You know, if you're going to need, you know, if you're dealing with multiple parties and you don't necessarily trust them, and you know, there's not a really good or third-party intermediary to kind of validate the trust between the parties, or they're too expensive. And then, or if you want, you know, traceability or auditability, that's what it's good for.
Okay. All right, we'll stick around for questions. Thank you very much.